the Big Ten in 2023, their revenue has been released now, and for the 5 out of the past 6 years, the Big Ten has made more revenue than the SEC. I have thoughts on this, but Russ, I'm curious yours more like what your thoughts are. Do you think this is good for the Big Ten? Do you think this will continue for the Big Ten? What are your thoughts here, Russ?
Yeah, I think this is a example of how the Big Ten kind of got out ahead of some of this stuff by expanding their footprint. Right, that was one of the big phrases they used when we added, the Rutgers and the Marylands and the Nebraskas of the world. That it's not just about what our best teams do, the Alabama and the Georgia, or the Ohio State and the Michigan. Like, yes, that's important, but if you can add more markets, you're going to add a lot more share than if you try to add 5% to the Ohio State fan base or the Michigan fan base. You expand that footprint, was one of the first and kind of got out in front of that, then that's what's going to happen. You're going to see what that chart looks like where Big Ten has done a much better job at that, I think, than the SEC. And now obviously these conferences are all kind of going that direction. So it'd be interesting to see what those other conferences look like tied into that. But I think that's what this is an example of, is how Big Ten, they just got out ahead of it. They expanded their footprint. They got to the East Coast. They got to the West Coast first now. And that's what happens.
Yeah, Brian makes a good point here. Bigger markets in the Big Ten footprint than the SEC footprint, and it's paying off for the Big Ten. They've gone out, and people kind of laughed when they added Rutgers and Maryland and those kind of places, but those are really good markets for the Big Ten. Maybe they not, been the best teams.
A nice college town, but it's not New York or Chicago or LA.
Exactly. So when you bring in these bigger markets, and who have they added? Los Angeles, Seattle. Eugene's not the biggest market in the world, but I mean that's still the Oregon brand, the Nike brand, with Phil Knight and everything out there. So that's going to attract eyeballs. Zach, what are your thoughts here?
I think you were saying something pre-show that I thought was helpful, is that you look at the state of some of the Big Ten programs, and maybe they're starting to elevate pay for coaches more and more, but that wasn't a thing really until the last few years, to become more competitive with the SEC. And I think what's incredible about this is if you look at the competitiveness of the Big Ten and kind of the coaching compensation, it has not necessarily been on par with the SEC, maybe with the exception of the higher tier programs. Imagine now, you have an edge in the revenue. Only one national championship in the past 10 years. SEC has kind of owned it outside of Clemson. And they've been on the cutting edge of paying their coaches. Now, all of a sudden, Big Ten has better infrastructure, even with those disadvantages. Now they're going to start paying coaches more. Now you have more high-end programs, and you're getting better coaches, I think, in the lower tier programs, as we'll talk about in the hot seat rankings coming up. I think there is a real opportunity for the Big Ten to kind of take this and go to really go to 60, 70 miles an hour here and really start outpacing the SEC. The SEC does have the recruiting advantage, right? You can't simulate Florida and Ohio or Indiana. You just can't. You can't simulate their population, but I think
can't simulate their weather where they can practice and play year round too.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So there are still geographical disadvantages for part of the Big Ten in terms of that. But I think with everything else, the fact that they have this financial infrastructure from their media deals and everything else, I really do think it means that the Big Ten is well positioned. They're already beating the SEC in revenue, and now they're well positioned to go above and beyond that.
Yeah, I think the Big Ten just really needs to capitalize on this revenue. Some of my notes I had is I look at some of the rankings here recently in May. CBS put out their coaches rankings in this month, and this is their consensus rankings. And you can argue maybe this guy one or two spots here and there, but at the end of the day, the Big Ten has 3 coaches in their top 10: Ryan Day, Lincoln Riley, and Dan Lanning. Dan Lanning and Lincoln Riley are at 9 and 10. Ryan Day is at 2, I think.
Yep.
He was at 2. 2 of those coaches were just added this year. These were programs that were not getting paid the Big Ten money, and they won't be getting paid the Big Ten money until this year. And yet these are two programs that now are adding top 10 coaches to the Big Ten. 4 SEC coaches are in the top 10. Kalen DeBoer was just hired this year, his very first year in the conference. Steve Sarkisian was just added this year. So if you want to talk about the Lincoln Riley and Dan Lanning thing, you can talk about that there. Brian Kelly was hired, 2-3 years ago? He's in his 3rd year now, I believe. And then Kirby Smart's been there since 2016. So it's kind of a weird situation here. And then the facilities rankings, and then Max, I promise I'll let you speak on this here, but facilities rankings, Ohio State, Nebraska, and Oregon are in the top 10. These were facility rankings that 24/7 put out. I forget the name of the author who put them out. I apologize. But in the top 10 for the SEC was Alabama, Georgia, Texas A&M, LSU, Auburn, and South Carolina. That's 6 for the SEC and 3 for the Big Ten. The next highest one for the Big Ten in the top 15 is Northwestern. And you go to the top 15 and the Big Ten has 4 teams in the top 15, and the SEC has 10 teams in the top 15. So we are working better on, coaches and doing that kind of stuff here. But at the same time, there is an arms race, at least in facilities, which I know are not nearly as important as they once were with how players are able to make money now. NIL is kind of more of an important thing, but there is kind of an arms race here that the Big Ten is falling a bit behind, at least in the facilities. And if they don't start hiring better coaches, then they could start falling behind in the coaches as well. Max, what are your thoughts on the Big Ten, or if you have any thoughts on what I just talked about with the facilities and coaches?
Yeah, no, I honestly really don't have too much else to add from whatever, everything else you guys said is pretty much spot on, and I agree with. And yeah, I think the biggest thing that stands out is just the fact that the Big Ten now goes coast to coast, almost all 4 corners of the map. I mean, just having, the SEC, it feels like every fan base is kind of the same, right? Maybe outside of Texas, Oklahoma, adding them, but Big Ten now, I mean, you got your Penn State fans are a lot different than your Oregon fans, are a lot different than your USC fans. It just feels like having that, that collective. I don't like rooting for a conference, but you have so many more people and then so many different fan bases now kind of rooting for the same thing that, I don't know. I think it's kind of cool that we can all kind of come together in that sense. Whereas the SEC, it's always been, the SEC, it just means more here. Like, I don't know. I think having all that diversity in fan bases and then just the history and all the different rivalries you're bringing in now is, I think, going to be a lot more entertaining and more fun to follow. If you're just a casual college football fan too, you have just so many more options to choose from. Whereas the SEC, is it Georgia or Alabama this year, or is it going to be Texas? It seems like it's going to be mostly the same teams, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I agree. And, at the end of the day, if Alabama, with who they are, if they do hire a brand new head coach, it should be somebody in the top 10, right? They should have the financial backing and the history to be able to do that. Interesting comment from Brian here, Zach. I want to get your thoughts. Some programs are just fine with complacency. They'll get their big payday, whether they upgrade their facilities or not. I think a piece of this is also, Zach, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, because I do think Brian makes a good point here, but I do think that a piece of this is that the Big Ten does have a lot of Olympic sports that they value very highly, and so they don't put as much money toward football as the SEC teams do because there are more sports that they try to evenly distribute this money out from. And so just because the Big Ten is making more money doesn't necessarily mean that Big Ten football is going to be producing more money than maybe SEC football. Would you agree or disagree with that, Zach?
I think that's one piece of it. I wonder, and this is just branching off that, JR, I wonder how much of it too is, when Urban Meyer came in 2012, it kind of felt like the Big Ten started to shift their philosophy in a lot of different ways. And I still think there's some of the roots of that. Like, you had the gentleman's agreement, like we're not going to recruit once they're committed, which obviously died. But I think even like the pace of upgrading facilities, I think the Big Ten has just always been a bit slower. We've always been the academic conference. We've always been the, like, we do it the right way conference. And now the right way is, the wild, wild west of NIL, and you have all this revenue. And so I think in some ways, I could see certain programs like with what Brian's saying, but I think between the Olympic sports and also just the reality that the culture is very different, like has been different for decades, and how Big Ten programs think about their football program. And I think it's shifting, but I think sometimes it takes a long time to turn a cruise ship, in a sense. And I would say that's kind of what programs have to do.
I like the idea that the Big Ten is a cruise ship and the SEC is like just a bunch of canoes or something like that. I like that thought there, Zach. Russ, your final thoughts here, and then we'll move on to the hot seat rankings.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a whole lot more to add other than, one thing I was thinking of is, the Big Ten, as much as I talked about these committees have to have more coaches and former players on them, the Big Ten has looked at this as more of a business. Yeah, it's nice to win national championships, but, from a revenue and money-making standpoint, having national championships and having guys in the NFL that can donate $500,000, $1 million, that's nice, and the SEC's got that, but getting a $800 million TV deal is a lot easier than getting, 150 guys in the NFL that are going to donate 500, it's the better battle is to get that big chunk of change from the media side of things and then put in the programs. And, I think that Big Ten programs have started to shift. Purdue's one of them that, in the last 5-6 years, they've started to put more money into the football program, and you've seen it start to kind of pay off for us through the Jeff Brom era and what Matt Painter's continue to do. And I think that the Big Ten, you'll see that shift, like Zach was saying, you'll start to see that turn. It won't be overnight, but these schools will start putting more of that money into the programs that make the school money to just get that snowball continued going.
Yeah, and I think that the SEC has realized that for a long time, and like the Big Ten, they just like, I know at least in Ohio State's case, I don't want to accuse every single school out there, but like in Ohio State's case, like they've had the same football facilities for years, and in the meantime, they've built like women's softball facilities, and name your other program here, athletic program here that they've built facilities for, which is hard because I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Like, I want these other athletic programs in the college to have good facilities as well. But like you said, Russ, there is one sport that makes the most money for all of the programs, and in the Big Ten, it doesn't seem like that sport is valued nearly as much as it is in the SEC. And so the Big Ten can make all the money they want, but if they're not going to value their football programs the same way that the SEC values their football programs, it's not going to matter. Which some people might say is the right thing, that the schools should value them. The football programs should not be valued so highly. I would tend to disagree, but that's just me. So